Let's take a second and talk about fairness. Imagine that you've got two homeless people in the street, and I've got two houses to give them, one of which is a 3-bedroom, 2-bath home in a nice, safe neighborhood, and the other home is a shed, like a literal run-down shed. Would you say that they're given equal housing? Why not? Both of them get the same amount of shelter. Keep watching to see what I'm actually talking about. Welcome to Learning with Sprayberry, where we make social studies fun, easy, and educational. Today we're jumping into a landmark Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson. The case comes down to the argument that separate but equal is fine. We'll get into what that means in a minute. The Civil War ends in 1865 and slavery is ended with the 13th Amendment. Life gets marginally better for African Americans. The radical Republicans take over Reconstruction and get the 14th Amendment passed, which grants citizenship to former slaves, and is quickly followed up by the 15th Amendment granting the right to vote. You'd think that African Americans would be living on cloud nine, but centuries of racial bias continue to make life difficult for blacks. Southern states quickly try to find legal loopholes for removing African Americans' newly granted rights. These loopholes come in two major categories: Black codes and Jim Crow laws. Black codes were laws that were passed in a majority of southern states with the purpose of removing many rights granted to former slaves. Many of these laws also included provisions that forced blacks to participate in a labor economy for little pay or debt-based work. Essentially, these laws are designed to recreate slavery as close as legally possible. For example, in some Louisiana parishes, blacks were not allowed into town without a note from their white employer. Other laws required that African Americans were to be in the employ of a white employer. Another way that southern states tried to control freed slaves was through the use of Jim Crow laws. These laws have specific purposes of keeping blacks and whites segregated. This is designed to serve a couple of very biased reasons. One, Southern whites didn't want to see African Americans as equal. It's much easier to keep this from happening if blacks are relegated to the worst parts of town. Additionally, it helps continue the subjugation mentality that Southern slave owners have spent centuries attempting to cultivate in black population. Just because these laws were passed doesn't mean that they were always successful in keeping African Americans down. Many of these laws were challenged in court, giving the country the chance to rectify the wrongdoings in these laws. That leads us to the case. Louisiana passes the Separate Car Act in 1890, which requires railroads to provide separate cars for black and white passengers. This law definitely falls into the category of Jim Crow laws. A group of concerned citizens decided to challenge the law. This group approached Homer Plessy to serve as the focus of the case. Plessy had mixed heritage. He was 1/8 black and born a free man. Laws in Louisiana categorized him as black despite most of his heritage being white. This declaration meant legally he was required to use the black car on railroads despite his relatively Caucasian appearance. Plessy bought a first-class ticket on June 7, 1892, and he attempted to sit in the white section of the train. The group of citizens had hired a private detective to arrest Plessy. Why? Well, to make sure that he's charged with violating the Separate Car Act as opposed to anything else. If the purpose is to challenge this law specifically, it's not going to help if he gets charged with some other crime. Once arrested, he was escorted off the train. Plessy's case relied heavily on the 13th and 14th Amendment to argue the law's failure. The 14th Amendment, which is mostly discussed as granting citizenship, also has a clause which grants the same protection under the law no matter your race. So, by requiring Plessy to sit in a separate car, the state of Louisiana denied him equal protection under the law. The judge, John Howard Ferguson, ruled that Louisiana could regulate the railroads as they saw fit. Plessy was found guilty and fined $25. The case was appealed to the Louisiana State Supreme Court, where it was upheld. The Louisiana Supreme Court cited precedents from other states, including northern states, to support its decision. One of the laws cited was from Pennsylvania and stated that separateness is not to declare inferiority. This was appealed one more time to the U.S. Supreme Court in 1896. The case, when it reached the Supreme Court, was argued on the same grounds of violating the 13th and 14th Amendment. Plessy's lawyer, Albanian Turgi, argued that black people had been regarded as slaves for so long that they were still linked to property and therefore able to be delegated to certain locations. And the 14th Amendment was violated because he was legally forced to sit in a separate location without due process of law. The Attorney General of Louisiana, who was charged with defending the state, was Milton Cunningham. Cunningham was a known white supremacist who argued that Louisiana was perfectly within its rights to defend this case. Once the case was heard, the Supreme Court made its decision. The decision was 7-1 against Plessy. One justice wasn't involved due to a family emergency. The 7 justices argued that Louisiana had not violated the 13th Amendment. The court's opinion was that the 13th Amendment granted no rights to African Americans except what was needed to end slavery. As for the argument that the Separate Car Act violates the 14th Amendment, the court argued that the purpose of the 14th wasn't to prevent social discrimination, but it was to enforce the absolute equality of the two races before the law, but in the nature of things. It could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or to enforce social as distinguished from political equality, or a commingling of the two races upon terms unsatisfactory to either. Essentially, the court argued that separation was fine because separation alone is not a statement of which race or group is superior or inferior. The court went further to explain that a law separates people but doesn't try to reduce the status of one group is perfectly legal. Only one justice, John Marshall Harlan, dissented the decision. Now, don't start believing that this guy's an angel. He was just a legal realist. He states, the white race dreams itself to be the dominant race in this country, and so it is in prestige, in achievement, in education, in wealth, and in power. So I doubt not it will continue to be for all time. If it remains true to its great heritage and holds fast to the principles of constitutional liberty, but in the view of the Constitution, in the eye of the law, there is in this country no superior, dominant, ruling class of citizens. There is no caste here. Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among its citizens. So he didn't exactly claim that blacks and whites are equal, but he does state that blacks and whites should be considered equal under the law and the Constitution. So what does this matter? The idea that separate but equal is a legal principle leads to natural consequences. Railroad cars aren't the only places where segregation is expected. Hotels begin, or in most cases continue, to refuse serving African American populations, pushing blacks to put each other up on trips. Theaters begin reserving the worst sections for African Americans. If they're allowed in at all, they have to sit in the balcony or so far away and high up that they're going to miss what's happening in the show. Bathrooms, water fountains, pools, buses also find themselves segregated. The decision in Plessy versus Ferguson in some ways can be viewed as the precursor to Rosa Parks' refusal to move. Plessy versus Ferguson had a long and lasting and seemingly endless series of consequences that we're still dealing with today. Let's hit up the question of the day. I'm going to go a little bit abstract with today's question, so try to stick with me. What do you think is the difference between fair and equal? Is there a difference between fair and equal? Let me know what you think down in the comments below. Thanks for watching Learning with Sprayberry, where we make social studies fun, easy, and educational. If you found this video useful, give me a thumbs up. If you want to see more social studies content, click subscribe. And if you want to make sure that you get notified, ring the bell. I'll catch you next time. I messed that all up.